The glass reflected a ghost. Not a man, but a tremor in a suit, hollowed out by the flickering numbers on the screen before him. They pulsed red, a cascade of failure, each digit a hammer blow against the fragile shell of his composure. He could feel their eyes on him, the predators of the trading floor, their silence more damning than any jeer. They could smell the fear, the desperation bleeding from his pores. One word, a single syllable whispered in his ear, had been the catalyst. A name. A phantom. Sila's. The man who had built empires and toppled them with the same serene indifference. The man who held the keys to the only kingdom Kai now craved, the one within. He had found him not in a skyscraper, but in a quiet, unassuming brownstone, a place that seemed to absorb the city's chaos and render it inert. The air inside was still, heavy with the scent of old books and something else, something ancient and unyielding like stone. Silas had listened without speaking, his gaze not judging but weighing. He saw the ambition, the raw, frantic hunger for more, but he also saw the rot beneath it, the fear of insignificance, the addiction to praise, the terror of loss. And after an eternity of silence, he had given Kai not a promise but a test. A single, impossible instruction tied to the biggest deal of Kai's young career. An instruction designed to fail. And now, watching the red tide wash away his future, Kai understood. This was the first lesson. The test wasn't on the screen. It was in the tightening of his chest, the fire in his stomach, the frantic screaming of his own mind. The test was happening right now, and he was failing. The journey to that brownstone had been one of desperation. It began weeks earlier, on a night that should have been a triumph. Kai had closed the Kensington account, a deal that had been a ghost in the firm for 3 years, a mythical beast no one could land. He had done it. He had walked through the office to a standing ovation, the sound a symphony to his starving ego. He felt the slaps on the back, the wide-eyed praise from the junior analysts, the begrudging nod from his direct superior, a man named Marcus whose approval he craved like a drug. He had gone home that night, the city lights a blur of victory, and had expected to feel something. Invincible, powerful. Instead, he felt a gnawing emptiness, a fraudulence that was terrifying. The applause was already a fading echo, the high already dissipating, leaving behind only the frantic need for the next one. Who was he without the win? The question echoed in the sterile silence of his apartment, a space that looked more like a showroom than a home. He was a collection of achievements, a resume given flesh, and he feared that if you stripped them away, there would be nothing left beneath. That fear had a voice. It whispered to him in the pre-dawn hours, when the city was quiet and the weight of his own expectations pressed down on him. It told him he wasn't good enough. It reminded him of every past failure, every slight, every moment of doubt. He tried to silence it with work, with punishing hours and a relentless pursuit of the next victory, but it was like trying to quench a fire with gasoline. The more he achieved, the louder the voice became, for the stakes were now higher, the fall now greater. He saw the same hunger, the same quiet desperation in the eyes of his peers. They were all runners on a treadmill, sprinting toward a horizon that never got any closer, fueled by a corrosive cocktail of ambition and anxiety. They called it drive. They called it the hustle. But Kai was beginning to see it for what it was, a prison of their own making. He started searching, not for another strategy or a new market to conquer, but for a different way. He devoured books on performance, on psychology, on the habits of the great men of history. He stumbled upon the Stoics, not in a classroom, but in the footnotes of a biography of a billionaire investor who credited his success not to financial acumen, but to a letter written by a Roman philosopher 2,000 years ago. Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus. The names were foreign, the concepts initially abstract, but one idea snagged in his mind and refused to let go: the inner citadel. The concept of building a fortress within your own mind, a place of unassailable peace and strength, a sanctuary that external events, no matter how catastrophic, could not breach. The idea was intoxicating. a power not dependent on the market, on the approval of others, on the fickle nature of fortune, a power that could not be taken away. His search for the practical application of this idea led him to whispers of Silas. There were no articles, no interviews, no social media presence. He was a ghost in the digital age. His name was spoken only in quiet corners by the truly powerful, the men and women who moved the world not with noise but with quiet, deliberate action. They spoke of him not as a consultant or a coach, but as a kind of architect, an architect of the soul. They said he didn't teach you how to win. He taught you how to be immune to losing. He didn't give you answers. He forged you into a person who no longer needed them. Finding Silas had been a test in itself, a labyrinth of dead ends and cryptic referrals. It required a stripping away of ego, an admission of powerlessness that was anathema to Kai's entire being. He had to ask for help. He had to be vulnerable. When he was finally given the address, there was no appointment. There was only the instruction, go when you have nothing left to lose. That moment came after the Kensington deal, in the hollow silence of his own victory. He stood before the brownstone, the city roaring at his back, and felt like a man confessing a terminal illness. He laid it all bare for Silas. The ambition, the emptiness, the fear, the desperate need for a foundation in his life that wasn't built on the shifting sands of external validation. Silas, a man whose age was impossible to guess, with eyes that seemed to hold a profound and ancient stillness, had listened without a single flicker of expression. He let the frantic torrent of Kai's words spill into the quiet room and dissolve. When Kai was finished, breathless and exposed, Silas finally spoke, his voice calm and resonant. "You wish to build a fortress," he said, his words not a question but a statement. "But you come to me with rotten stone and sand for mortar. The materials you have used to build your life, the praise of others, the accumulation of wealth, the trophies of victory, they are worthless. They cannot bear the weight of a true life. The first storm will wash them all away." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "You believe your strength lies in your achievements. That is your greatest weakness. You are a puppet and you allow the world to pull your strings. A word of praise and you dance. A word of criticism and you collapse. A market upturn and you are a king. A downturn and you are a beggar. This is not power. This is slavery." Kai felt a surge of indignation, the familiar sting of his ego being challenged. But it was quickly extinguished by the cold, undeniable truth of the words. He was a slave. He had never realized it until this moment. "The path to building the Citadel is not one of addition, but of subtraction," Silas continued. "You must demolish the life you have built. You must tear down the false structures of your ego, stone by stone. You must become comfortable with the rubble. You must learn to stand in the ruins, exposed and without defense, and find your strength there, in the bedrock of your own being. Most who seek this path run from the dust and the noise of the demolition. They prefer the comfort of their beautiful, fragile prison." He looked at Kai, his gaze piercing. "Are you willing to face the demolition?" Kai, with a conviction that surprised him, a conviction born not of arrogance but of pure, unadulterated desperation, had said yes. And that had led to now, the test. Silas had reviewed the prospectus for the Acuity deal, the biggest of Kai's career, a 9-figure behemoth he had spent months assembling. He had pointed to a single, obscure clause, a regulatory dependency tied to foreign exchange fluctuations. Silas's instruction had been simple and insane. Do not hedge against it. Leave it exposed. Kai had argued, had pleaded. It was professional suicide. The risk was enormous, completely unnecessary. It was a 1 in 100 chance of a currency swing that dramatic. "Is the swing of the currency within your control?" Silas had asked. "No, but hedging the risk is," Kai had retorted. "You seek to control the uncontrollable," Silas had replied, his voice even. You place your peace of mind in the hands of the market. You are gambling with your serenity, not just your money. The task is not to control the storm. The task is to be the rock the storm breaks against. Leave it exposed. And when the storm comes, your only task is to observe your own mind. That is the field of battle, not this office, not that screen. In here. He had tapped his own temple. Do this and your real training will begin. Fail and you will never see me again. So Kai had done it, an act of terrifying faith. He had submitted the deal raw and exposed, and the 1-in-100 storm had come. A sudden political event overseas had sent the currency into a freefall, triggering the very clause he had left open. The deal had imploded spectacularly. Millions of dollars of potential revenue gone, months of work incinerated. His reputation, a pillar of his identity, was turning to ash. And here he was, watching the ghost in the glass. The phones on his desk were silent. The usual cacophony of the floor had muted, a bubble of morbid curiosity forming around him. Marcus, his boss, was walking toward him, his face a mask of cold fury. The demolition had begun. The storm was here. And Silas's words echoed in his mind. Your only task is to observe your own mind. He took a breath. He felt the panic, a frantic bird beating against the cage of his ribs. He felt the shame, a hot flush creeping up his neck. He felt the rage at himself, at Silas, at the sheer, stupid randomness of the universe. He observed it all. He let the feelings surge, but for the first time in his life he did not become them. He was not the panic. He was not the shame. He was the observer of the panic. He was the witness to the shame. A tiny, infinitesimally small space began to open up between the event and his reaction to it. It was a space as thin as a razor's edge, but it was there. Marcus was in front of him now. His voice was low, seething. My office now. Kai looked at his reflection one last time. The tremor was still there, but something else was beginning to form behind the eyes of the ghost, a flicker of something hard, something quiet, something new. He turned, and for the first time he walked toward the fire, not as a victim, but as a student. The office felt like an airlock, the pressure inside immense. Marcus didn't shout. Shouting was for equals. This was a dissection. He laid out the failure in brutal, clinical detail, each word a scalpel carving away at Kai's professional identity. The lost revenue. The damage to the firm's reputation. The sheer, inexplicable stupidity of leaving such a massive exposure unhedged. I have never in my 15 years on this floor seen such a catastrophic lapse in judgment, Marcus said, his voice a low, dangerous hum. You had this. It was a done deal. All you had to do was follow basic protocol. What were you thinking? Kai's mind screamed with 1,000 justifications. He could blame the market's unpredictability. He could try to craft a complex intellectual defense. He could expose Silas, paint himself as the victim of a madman's experiment. The impulse to defend, to deflect, to salvage his ego was overwhelming. It was a physical force, a coiling in his gut. But Silas's words echoed again. Observe your own mind. He observed the desperate urge to lie. He observed the childish impulse to blame someone else. He observed the terror of being seen as a fool. And in that sliver of space he had found earlier, he made a choice. He chose not to feed the beast. He looked directly at Marcus, holding his gaze. There is no explanation that would be acceptable, Kai said, his voice steady, shockingly so. It was my responsibility. I failed to manage the risk. The failure is mine alone. The silence that followed was more profound than the tirade that had preceded it. Marcus was clearly taken aback. He had expected excuses, panic, pleading. He had come prepared for a fight, for the flailing of a drowning man. He was not prepared for this quiet, unyielding acceptance of blame. It disarmed him. That's it, Marcus asked, his anger momentarily replaced by confusion. My failure. Years of work, millions of dollars down the drain, and that's all you have to say. What else is there to say that matters? Kai asked, a genuine question. The numbers are the numbers. The outcome is the outcome. My feelings about it, my excuses, my justifications, they don't change the reality of it. The deal is dead, and I am the one who killed it. He felt a strange lightness in this admission. The frantic energy he usually spent on impression management, on defending the fragile fortress of his ego, was gone, and in its place was a strange, solid calm. He was standing in the ruins just as Silas had described, and he was still standing. The world had thrown its worst at him, and he had not shattered. His career might be over. His reputation might be destroyed. But he, the core of him, the observer within, was untouched. Marcus stared at him for a long moment, his eyes searching Kai's face for a crack, a sign of the usual panic. He found none. What he found instead was a stillness that was unnerving. "Clean out your desk," he finally said, his voice flat, devoid of its earlier venom. The sentence was a death blow, but Kai received it not as a wound, but as a simple fact. An external event, something outside of his control. His response, however, was entirely within it. He nodded once. "Thank you for the opportunity you gave me," he said, and he meant it. He had learned more in the last 10 minutes of failure than he had in 3 years of success. Walking back to his desk was a surreal experience. The vultures were circling, their whispers following him. They saw a dead man walking. He saw them for what they were, prisoners just as he had been. Their sense of superiority was dependent on his failure. Their self-worth was a reflection in the eyes of others. He felt not anger, but a strange, unexpected pity. He packed his belongings into a small cardboard box. The photos, the deal trophies, the symbols of a life he had just demolished. They felt like artifacts from another person's existence. He looked at the trading screen, still glowing with the red of his failure. It was just a screen, just light and numbers. It had no power over him. It had never had any power over him. The power had always been in his interpretation of it, his assent to the idea that those red numbers meant that he was a failure. He now knew better. The numbers were a failure. The deal was a failure. He was not. As he walked toward the elevator, box in hand, he passed Marcus's office again. The door was ajar. Marcus was on the phone, his back to the door. "I don't know," Marcus was saying, his voice a mixture of frustration and something else, grudging respect. "He just took it. He owned it. I've never seen anything like it. I was ready to tear him to shreds, and he just stood there, solid as a rock. It was the strangest damn thing." Kai didn't smile. The need for that kind of validation was the old world, the world of the puppet, but he registered the words. He observed them. And he walked into the elevator, the doors closing on the life that was no longer his. The descent in the elevator felt like an ascent. He had lost everything he thought he wanted. And in doing so, he had gained the only thing he truly needed, a single, unshakable brick in the foundation of his inner citadel. He walked out of the building into the chaos of the city, but the noise no longer seemed to penetrate. He was the eye of his own storm. He was ready for his next lesson. The brownstone was unchanged. The city's noise died at its doorstep. When Silas opened the door, he didn't smile, nor did he offer condolences. He simply nodded, as if Kai were merely late for a scheduled appointment, and stepped aside. Kai walked in, placing the small box of his former life on the floor. It seemed insignificant, a child's collection of trinkets. "The demolition is loud," Silas said, his voice filling the quiet space. "It frightens those who have grown accustomed to the gentle hum of their prison." "I was fired," Kai said. The words were simple fact, stripped of the emotional charge they would have carried just yesterday. "Your employment was terminated," Silas corrected gently. "You were not. Do you see the difference?" Kai did. He saw it with a clarity that was astonishing. One was an event, The other was an identity. He had spent his entire life conflating the two. I think so. I accepted it. I didn't fight back, didn't make excuses. I just let it happen. You did not let it happen, Silas said, turning to face him. You misunderstand. Things happen. The world is a torrent of events, a relentless cascade of cause and effect. You do not let the river flow, it simply flows. Your only choice is whether you will be a withered leaf tossed about by the current or a stone, allowing the water to rush past. You did not surrender. You stood your ground, the ground of your own mind. Silas gestured toward two simple chairs near a window overlooking a small, walled garden. You have taken the first step. You have learned the foundation of all inner freedom, the principle upon which every citadel is built, the dichotomy of control. Most of humanity wastes its existence in a state of civil war, fighting against reality. They rage against the weather, they despair over the economy, they are tormented by the opinions of others. They are crushed by past events they cannot change and terrified of future events they cannot command. They are fighting a war on 1,000 fronts, a war they can never win, for they are battling things that are not theirs to control. Kai thought of the trading floor, the constant, frantic anxiety, the desperate attempts to predict and command the chaotic surge of the market. He thought of his own sleepless nights, replaying conversations, agonizing over what people might think of him. He had been a general fighting 1,000 phantom wars. Your will, Silas continued, his voice drawing Kai's full attention, your choices, your judgments, your responses, your assent to the impressions that bombard you, these are the things that are yours. This is your kingdom. It is a small kingdom, but it is absolute. Outside of that kingdom lies the rest of the universe. The actions of others, your reputation, your health, your wealth, the turning of the planets, the flowing of the river. You have influence over some, but ultimate control over none. The undisciplined mind makes no distinction. It seeks to rule the world outside and in doing so, abdicates the throne of its own kingdom. The result is not power, but perpetual anxiety and fear. He leaned forward slightly. The event on the trading floor was a fire. The undisciplined man runs into the blaze, trying to command the flames, and is consumed. The wise man steps back. He does not control the fire, but he controls his response to the fire. He can feel its heat, but he is not burned by it. Yesterday, you stood outside the fire for the first time. You felt the heat of shame, of fear, of loss, but you did not allow it to consume you. You chose your response. You chose to accept reality. You chose integrity over ego. In that moment, in that office, you were freer than the man who was firing you. The truth of this resonated in Kai's very bones. Marcus, in his rage, was a slave to the event. He was controlled by the numbers on the screen. His peace was shattered. Kai, who had lost everything, had been the one in possession of himself. But it's not enough to simply divide the world into what I can and cannot control, Kai said, thinking aloud. I still felt the fear, the shame. It was there. It was real. Ah, Silas said, a faint glimmer in his eyes. You have discovered the next layer. Observing the fire is the first step. The next is to learn to use its heat. You have endured the storm. Now you must learn to love it. This brings us to the second principle, a concept the fools call pessimism and the wise call a weapon, amor fati, a love of your fate. Kai frowned. Love it, love being fired, love losing everything. It sounded absurd, a form of masochism. Tell me, Silas said, ignoring his objection. This, failure, what has it cost you? My job, my reputation, my income, my future, possibly. The list was long and heavy. And what has it given you? The question stopped him, given him. It was a destructive event, a purely negative one. But as he thought about it, an alternative ledger began to form in his mind. It gave me this conversation. It freed me from a path I was beginning to hate. It showed me my own weakness, my own slavery to praise. It forced me to test this philosophy in a real way, not just as an intellectual exercise. He looked at Silas. It brought me here. Icely, Silas affirmed. The obstacle in the path becomes the path. The impediment to action advances action. The fire that seems to destroy you is, in fact, the fire that forges you. The undisciplined mind sees an event as good or bad based on its immediate comfort or discomfort. If it is pleasant, it is good. If it is painful, it is bad. This is the logic of a child. The disciplined mind, the mind of the apprentice building his citadel, asks a different question. Not is this good or bad, but how can I use this? Amor fati is not a passive acceptance of suffering, Silas explained, his voice intense. It is an active alchemical transformation of it. It is the ability to look at any event, a betrayal, a financial loss, an illness, a public humiliation, and not just endure it, not just find the silver lining, but to embrace it as if you had chosen it yourself. To say, this is what I needed. Because whatever happens, whatever obstacle is thrown in your path, is a perfect opportunity to practice some virtue. Patience, courage, integrity, wisdom, self-control. He stood and walked toward a shelf filled with old, leather-bound books. An ancient emperor, one who understood this better than most, wrote to himself, "The art of living is more like wrestling than dancing in that it stands ready for what comes and is not thrown by the unforeseen." This failure of yours, it was a perfect wrestling partner. It tested your grip. It tested your balance. It revealed the flaws in your stance. Would you have learned these things from a victory? No, Kai admitted. Victory had only made him weaker, more arrogant, more dependent on the next win. So which was the more valuable event? Silas asked. The triumph of the Kensington deal, which fed your ego and deepened your slavery, or the catastrophe of the Acuity deal, which broke your chains and set you on this path? The world calls one a success and the other a failure. The apprentice must learn to see with different eyes. The concept was radical, a complete inversion of everything he had ever been taught. It was not about turning lemons into lemonade. It was about seeing the lemon as the exact ingredient you needed to create something far more valuable than you had originally intended. It was an offensive weapon against the randomness of fate. I don't know if I can love the pain, Kai said honestly. Do not try to love the pain, Silas corrected. Love what the pain can produce. A blacksmith does not love the heat of the forge. He loves the sword it creates. The pain of the event is the heat. The virtue you forge from it is the sword. Your humiliation was the heat. The integrity and calm you forged was the sword. Now you possess that sword. It is yours forever. The money you lost was never truly yours to begin with. Which is the greater wealth? The question needed no answer. Your next task, Silas announced, turning from the bookshelf, is not a theoretical one. Life will provide the curriculum. Your employment has been terminated. You have no income. Your reputation in your chosen field is, for the moment, toxic. You are adrift. The world would call this a crisis, a disaster. You will call it an opportunity. You will embrace this. Every rejection you face, every door that is slammed in your face, every condescending look from your former peers. You will not merely endure it. You will treat it as a necessary and vital ingredient for the man you are becoming. You will seek out the struggle, not avoid it. Your goal is not to find a new job. Your goal is to use the search for a new job as your new forge. Go. And do not return until you have learned to thank the world for the obstacles it puts in your way. Kai left the brownstone and stepped back into a world that looked the same but felt entirely different. He was a man without a title, without a salary, without the scaffolding of corporate identity that had held him up for his entire adult life. He was naked, and for the first time, it felt less like vulnerability and more like freedom. The city's indifferent crowds rushed past him. Before, he had seen them as a gallery to be impressed. Now he saw them as fellow travelers, each fighting their own phantom wars. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't have a plan. For the first time in his life, that was not a source of terror, but of profound, electrifying possibility. The path had disappeared, and that meant the real journey could finally begin. The first few weeks were a brutal education in the practice of amor fati. Theory met reality, and reality was a cold, hard floor. Kai's severance was minimal, and the rent on his sterile apartment was astronomical. The first task was downsizing. He sold the designer furniture, the $1,000 suits, the watch that had once been his most prized symbol of success. Each sale was a small death to his ego. He remembered the pride he felt buying these things, the sense of arrival. Now he was haggling with strangers over their price, a ghost haunting his own life. The old Kai would have been consumed by humiliation. He would have seen it as a fall from grace, a public confirmation of his failure. But with Silas's words echoing in his mind, he forced himself to reframe it. Each object he sold was not a loss of status, but a severing of a chain. The watch didn't tell time, it told the world he was successful. The suits weren't clothes, they were a costume. He was shedding a skin, and while the process was raw and uncomfortable, it was also liberating. He moved into a small, one-room apartment in a less fashionable part of the city, a place with thin walls and the constant rumble of the elevated train. The emptiness of his old life was replaced by the noise and grit of this new one, and he found, to his astonishment, that he slept better. He was no longer trying to live up to his surroundings. The job hunt was the true forge. He reached out to his network, the people who had slapped him on the back and called him a killer just a month ago. The calls went unreturned. Emails were met with polite but firm rejections. He was toxic. The story of the Acuity deal had spread, likely embellished by Marcus and others. He was the reckless one, the cowboy who had crashed and burned. One afternoon he had a coffee meeting with a former colleague, a man named David who had always been friendly. The meeting was a disaster. David was visibly uncomfortable, spending the entire time checking his phone. He offered empty platitudes. "Tough break, man, the market is brutal right now." But his eyes said something else. They said, "Stay away from me. Your failure is contagious." As they parted, David said, "Look, Kai, I'd love to help, but you know how it is. My name is on the line." Walking away from that cafe, the old feelings surged. Rage, humiliation, the bitter sting of betrayal. He felt the familiar heat in his chest, the desire to scream at the injustice of it all. He had been a top performer, celebrated and courted. Now he was a leper. He stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, the city's frantic energy swirling around him. He closed his eyes. The obstacle is the path. How can I use this? He forced himself to dissect the feeling. The pain came from an expectation. The expectation that David would be loyal, that his past successes should grant him some form of credit. This expectation was the source of his suffering. And it was an expectation about something outside of his control, David's character, David's fear. What could he control? His response. He could let this bitterness poison him, make him cynical and angry, or he could use it as a lesson, a powerful, painful lesson in the nature of fair-weather friends and the transactional nature of the world he had inhabited. This betrayal was a gift. It was showing him the truth. It was cauterizing a wound he didn't even know he had, his reliance on the approval and loyalty of deeply unreliable people. He took a deep breath and opened his eyes. He looked back at the cafe where David was now likely breathing a sigh of relief, and he felt a strange sense of gratitude. "Thank you, David," he whispered to the empty air. "Thank you for showing me the truth." He had loved his fate. He had taken the poison and transformed it into medicine. The rage in his chest subsided, replaced by the now familiar quiet calm. He had held his ground. This became his practice. Every rejection letter was not a no, but an opportunity to practice resilience. Every condescending interview where he was forced to explain his catastrophic failure was not a humiliation, but a chance to practice honesty and humility, to own his story without shame. He stopped seeing the job hunt as a means to an end, a new salary, a new title. He began to see the process itself as the work. The work was not securing a position. The work was building his citadel. He took a menial job to pay his rent, working in the stockroom of a bookstore. It was anonymous physical labor. He, who had once moved millions of dollars with a keystroke, was now unpacking boxes of paperbacks. The irony was not lost on him. His former colleagues would have seen this as the ultimate fall, a confirmation of his complete and utter ruin. Kai saw it as a sanctuary. There was a purity to the work. There was no ego, no politics, no impression management. The box was either heavy or it wasn't. It was either unpacked or it wasn't. His mind, freed from the constant, exhausting calculations of the corporate world, began to quiet down. In the quiet, he began to think. He read the books he was stocking: history, philosophy, poetry. He started to see the patterns of human behavior, the rise and fall of empires and individuals, the timeless struggles of ego and fear and ambition. His expensive, high-stakes education on the trading floor felt shallow and insignificant compared to the wisdom contained in these quiet, paper-bound volumes. He was learning to separate his self-worth from his net worth, his identity from his job title. He was becoming a man who could be content with very little, which meant the world had very little to threaten him with. The fear that had driven him his entire life, the fear of failure, of being nobody, was beginning to recede, because he had failed. He was, by his old world's definition, a nobody, and he was still here. He was breathing. He was thinking. He was, in a strange way, more himself than he had ever been. One evening, after a long shift, a man came into the bookstore. He was impeccably dressed, radiating an aura of quiet power and immense wealth. Kai recognized him instantly. He was Julian Croft, a legendary, almost mythical figure in the world of finance, a corporate raider known for his brilliant, ruthless strategies. He was a man Kai had once idolized, seeing him as the pinnacle of success. Julian browsed for a while, then brought a copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations to the counter. Kai rang it up, his hands dusty from the stockroom. Julian looked at him, a flicker of recognition in his sharp eyes. "You're Kai," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "You were with Sterling Thorne. I remember the Acuity deal. That was a bold move. Insane, but bold." Kai felt a familiar jolt, the instinct to be ashamed, to explain. He suppressed it. "It was a move," he said simply, his voice neutral. Julian smiled, a thin, predatory smile. "The talk on the street is you had a breakdown, that you torched your own career for no reason." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. "I don't believe that. A man who gets that close to closing a deal like Acuity doesn't just snap. Someone told you to do it. Someone was testing you." He looked at Kai, his eyes glinting. Was it Sila's? The name spoken in this context by this man felt like a sacrilege. Kai's face remained impassive. He simply slid the book into a bag. "That'll be $16.95. Julian laughed, a low, appreciative sound. "Playing it close to the vest, I like that." He pulled out a crisp $100 bill. "I'm building a new team, a special projects division. We're not playing by the old rules. We're making our own. I need thinkers. I need people who aren't afraid of risk, who aren't afraid to burn things down to build something new." He looked from Kai's dusty hands to his calm, steady eyes. What you're doing here, this is a waste. You're a weapon going rusty. I could give you your old life back and then some. More money than Sterling Thorne ever dreamed of. A seat at the real table. A year ago, this would have been the offer of a lifetime. It was everything Kai had ever wanted. Validation from a titan, a return to the game at the highest level, a chance to prove everyone wrong. The temptation was immense, a siren song calling to the remnants of his old ego. He could feel its pull, the seductive whisper of power, of revenge, of victory. He looked at Julian, at his perfectly tailored suit, his expensive watch, his eyes that held a universe of ambition but not a single flicker of peace. He saw a man in a beautiful, gilded prison, a man who was still a slave to the next win, the next conquest. He saw his own past, and he saw his future if he chose to accept. And in that moment, he knew he didn't want it. He pushed the change from the $100 bill across the counter. "I'm not looking for my old life," Kai said, his voice quiet but firm. "And I'm not a weapon." Julian's smile faltered for the first time. He stared at Kai, a deep, searching look of disbelief and perhaps a sliver of something that looked like envy. He took his change and the book. "A man who doesn't want anything," Julian mused, almost to himself. "That's a very dangerous man." He turned and walked out of the store, leaving the scent of expensive cologne and ambition in his wake. Kai watched him go, then turned to the next customer in line. He felt no sense of triumph, no smug satisfaction at having passed a test. He simply felt grounded. He had been offered the world he once craved, and he had refused it not as an act of pious self-denial, but simply because he no longer desired it. The heat of the forge had done its work. He had learned to thank his obstacles. He had learned to love his fate. It was time to see Sila's. When Kai returned to the brownstone, he didn't knock. He simply stood before the door, and after a moment it opened. Sila's was there, his expression unchanging, yet Kai felt he was being seen in a new way, assessed on a different level. "The world offered you a crown of fool's gold," Silas said, stepping back to let him enter. "And you did not take it." "How did you know?" Kai asked. "Men like Julian Croft move through the world with a great deal of noise," Silas replied. "But that is not how I knew. I knew because you are here. Had you accepted his offer, your path would have led you far from this door. You would be too busy polishing your new chains." They sat in the same chairs as before. The silence felt different this time. Less of a void Kai felt compelled to fill, and more of a shared, comfortable space. "I think I understand Amor Fati now," Kai said. "Not just as an idea, but as a practice. Every bad thing that happened, getting fired, being rejected, working a menial job, it wasn't an obstacle. It was the curriculum. It was exactly what I needed to learn." "Good," Silas said. "You have learned to turn poison into medicine. You have learned to wrestle with reality and use its own weight against it. But there is a danger here, a subtle trap for the apprentice. In embracing what happens, you can become passive. You can begin to believe that you are merely a creature of circumstance, albeit a resilient one. This is not the goal. The goal is not to be an unbreakable anvil, but to be the hammer, guided by a will of steel. This brings us to the next stage of building the Citadel, the discipline of the mind, the mastery of your own thoughts." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "You have learned to handle external catastrophes, but you have not yet conquered the enemy within. The real battle is not with the Julian Crofts of the world or the fickle opinions of your peers. The real battle is with the stories you tell yourself. The undisciplined mind is a relentless factory of fear, anxiety, and false judgment. It takes a simple, neutral event and wraps it in layers of terrifying narrative." Silas stood and walked to a small, unadorned table. He picked up a simple clay cup. "What is this?" he asked. "It's a cup," Kai replied. "Is it beautiful? Is it ugly? Is it valuable?" "It's just a cup," Kai said, unsure of the point. "Precisely, it is a cup, an object. It has no inherent quality of good or bad. Now, if this were the last cup your dying mother gave you, it would become precious. If it were the cup from which your greatest enemy drank poison, it would become hideous. The cup does not change. The story you attach to it changes. We do not react to events. We react to our judgments about events. And those judgments are the source of all our turmoil. He set the cup down. You did not suffer because you were fired. You suffered because you attached the judgment, "This is a catastrophe. This means I'm a failure to the event." You have learned to rewrite that story after the fact to find the opportunity in it. That is a powerful skill, but the master does not need to rewrite the story. The master does not write the false story in the first place. He sees the event for what it is. A cup is a cup. A job is lost. A comment is made. These are neutral facts. This was a deeper level, a more subtle and profound challenge. It was one thing to reframe a disaster after it happened. It was another thing entirely to meet the disaster at the gate and refuse to let it become a disaster in your own mind. This is the mastery of Ascent, Silas explained. Ascent is the moment you agree with your initial impression. An impression flashes into your mind. That person just insulted me. You have a choice. You can assent to it, agree with it, and the cascade of anger, shame, and retaliation begins. Or you can pause. You can examine the impression as if it were an object. You can ask, is this true? Is this within my control? What is the neutral fact here? The fact is, a person vibrated the air with sound waves. That is all. Your judgment that it was an insult is the story, and you are the author of that story. Kai thought back to his raw, immediate reactions his whole life. The flash of anger at a perceived slight, the jolt of fear at bad news. He had always believed these were automatic, uncontrollable reflexes. Silas was telling him they were not reflexes, but choices, made so quickly and habitually that they felt like reflexes. This is the most difficult discipline, Silas warned. It requires constant vigilance. Your mind has been running on autopilot for your entire life, assenting to every stray thought, every fearful projection, every ego-driven judgment. You must now become the guard at the gate of your own mind. You must question every impression that seeks entry into your citadel. Is it truth, or is it a story? Is it a fact, or is it a judgment? He gestured for Kai to stand. We will begin your training in this not with grand events but with small ones. The world outside is too noisy. For your next lesson, the forge will be silence and solitude. You will learn to face the relentless chatter of your own mind, and you will learn to quiet it, not by force but by observation and the refusal to assent. Silas led him to a part of the brownstone Kai had never seen, down a narrow flight of stairs into a cellar. It was not a dungeon but a simple, clean room. There was a bed, a small table with a pitcher of water and a single, unlit candle. The air was cool and still. There were no windows. "You will stay here," Silas said, his voice echoing slightly in the stone-walled room. "There is enough water, there is no food, you do not need it. The hunger you will feel is a physical sensation. It is a neutral fact. You will observe it, but you will not assent to the story your body tells you, the story of panic and desperation. The darkness you will experience is the absence of light. It is a neutral fact. You will observe it, but you will not assent to the fearful stories your mind populates it with. Your memories, your regrets, your anxieties about the future, they will arise like ghosts in this room. They are impressions. You will examine them, you will question them, and you will refuse to believe their lies." The idea was terrifying. No distractions, no work, no books, no phone, nothing but himself and his own mind. A mind he was just beginning to realize was a relentless and convincing liar. "How long?" Kai asked, his voice betraying a tremor of fear. "Time is another story we tell ourselves," Silas replied, standing in the doorway, the light from the hallway silhouetted behind him. "You will stay until you have learned the difference between the world as it is and the stories your mind tells you about it. You will stay until you are the master of your own ascent. He pulled the heavy wooden door shut. The click of the latch was deafening, and then there was only darkness and the sound of Kai's own breathing. The first hours were a blur of rebellion. Kai's mind, starved of its usual diet of stimulation, went into a frenzy. It screamed for escape. It paced the small room like a caged animal, measuring the darkness, testing the unyielding door. It replayed the conversation with Julian Croft, second-guessing the decision, painting vivid pictures of the power and wealth he had rejected. It conjured images of his former colleagues, laughing at his new ascetic life. He assented to every thought. He became the regret. He became the anger. He was a leaf in a hurricane of his own making. Then came the hunger. It started as a dull ache and grew into a sharp, demanding presence. His body screamed a story of imminent starvation, of wasting away. The panic was primal. He had to get out. He banged on the door, his voice hoarse, calling for Silas. There was no reply. The silence that answered him was absolute, a wall more solid than the stone around him. Defeated, he slid to the floor, consumed by the narrative of his own suffering. Sometime on what he guessed was the second day, something shifted. The energy of his panic was spent. His body was weak, his mind exhausted from its own relentless turmoil. The storm was abating, not because he had conquered it, but because it had burned itself out. In the deep quiet that followed, a new kind of awareness began to dawn. He felt the hunger in his stomach, but this time he didn't become the hunger, he observed it. It was a sensation, a tightness, a physical event. It was not a catastrophe. He was not dying. It was just a feeling. He refused to assent to the story of panic, and he found that the sensation itself, stripped of its narrative, was tolerable. A memory surfaced, the face of David, his former colleague, filled with pity and disdain. The familiar flush of shame and anger began to rise, but this time Kai was ready. He held the impression at arm's length. What was the neutral fact? A man had a certain facial expression. Sound waves vibrated in a certain way. That was it. The story, "He betrayed me, he thinks I'm a loser," was an addition. It was his own creation. It was a choice, and he could choose not to make it. He let the image go, refusing to give it the power of his ascent. It faded, a ghost without a host. This became his work. For hours, or perhaps days, time had lost all meaning. He sat in the darkness and simply watched the parade of his own thoughts. Each one, a regret from the past, an anxiety about the future, a judgment about the present. He would greet it at the gate. He would hold it up to the light of his new awareness and ask, "What is the simple fact here? And what is the story I am adding?" He began to realize how much of his life had been lived in a fiction. His confidence had been a story he told himself based on the praise of others. His despair had been a story he told himself based on the criticism of others. His entire sense of self was a narrative, a patchwork of judgments and interpretations, fragile and utterly dependent on external validation. He had never lived in the real world. He had lived in his own mental movie about the world. In the darkness, stripped of everything, he was finding the bedrock. He was not his job. He was not his reputation. He was not his successes or his failures. He was not even the thoughts that endlessly streamed through his mind. He was the watcher. He was the consciousness that could observe the thoughts without becoming them. He was the guard at the gate. At some point the hunger faded to a background hum. The darkness became a comforting blanket, not a source of fear. The silence became rich and full, not empty. He had stopped fighting. He was simply present. He was in a small, dark room with no food and no light. It was a neutral fact, and he was at peace. The door opened. The sudden sliver of light was blinding, painful. Silas stood there, his figure a dark shape against the brilliance. Kai didn't move. He simply looked at the light, observing the sensation on his retinas without judgment. The cup is a cup, Silas said. The cup is a cup, Kai replied, his voice raspy but clear. He had not won a battle. He had simply realized there was no battle to be fought. Come, Silas said. The next lesson requires the world again. Kai rose to his feet. He felt light, weak, but anchored in a way he had never been before. As he stepped out of the cellar and back into the world of light and sound, he felt like he was seeing it for the first time. The colors were sharper, the sounds more distinct. He was no longer filtering reality through a thick, grimy lens of judgment and narrative. He was just seeing it. He was ready for whatever came next, not because he was braced for it, but because he was open to it. The final stage of the apprenticeship was not about learning new principles, but about integrating the ones he had learned into a seamless whole. It was about pressure testing the nascent citadel in the chaos of the world. Silas did not create artificial tests anymore. He simply sent Kai back into the city with a single, cryptic instruction. Build something. It does not matter what. A business, a charity, a work of art. But build it from the foundation of your citadel, not from the ruins of your ego. Kai returned to the bookstore. He had no grand ambition, no desire to reclaim his former glory. He simply saw a need. The store was poorly organized, its inventory system archaic. It was a place of quiet potential, suffocated by inefficiency. He started there. He worked his stockroom shifts, and in his spare time he began to reorganize the store section by section. He built a simple digital inventory system on his old laptop. The owner, a kind but overwhelmed elderly man named Mr. Abernathy, watched him with a curious eye. He saw the quiet, relentless efficiency, the lack of any need for praise or recognition. Kai just did the work because the work needed to be done. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't angling for a promotion. He was simply applying his will to a corner of the world he could control. He practiced the mastery of Ascent every day. A rude customer was not a personal insult, but a person experiencing their own turmoil. A drop in sales was not a disaster, but a data point. He treated every event with the same calm, objective analysis. He felt the initial flicker of emotion, annoyance, worry, frustration, but he no longer assented to it. He let it pass, a cloud moving across the sky of his awareness. He practiced amor fati. A delayed shipment wasn't a problem. It was an opportunity to highlight other books, to rearrange a section, to discover a hidden gem in the overstock. He embraced the small frictions of daily life as his wrestling partners, each one making him stronger, more balanced. As the bookstore began to transform, to become cleaner, more organized, more profitable, word began to spread. People were drawn to the new energy of the place. It wasn't just a store. It was a curated, thoughtful space. Mr. Abernathy, overjoyed, offered Kai a management position, then a partnership. Kai accepted, not with the grasping hunger of his old self, but with a quiet sense of purpose. One afternoon, a man entered the store who stopped Kai in his tracks. It was Marcus, his old boss. He looked older, more tired. The ferocious energy was gone, replaced by a weary tension. He browsed for a moment before he saw Kai. His face registered a brief flash of shock, followed by a guarded awkwardness. "Kai," he said, "I heard you were. I didn't know you were here." "Hello, Marcus," Kai said, his voice even and calm. He felt no anger, no resentment, no smug sense of "look at me now." He simply saw a man before him. "Look," Marcus started, clearly uncomfortable. "About what happened, it was a tough situation. The pressure from the board was immense." He was making excuses, trying to rewrite the narrative of his own actions. Kai simply nodded, letting him speak. He didn't need an apology. He didn't need anything from this man. "The thing is," Marcus continued, his voice lowering, "the firm's been struggling. We've lost our edge. It's all noise, panic. No one thinks clearly anymore. I remembered that day in my office. How you just stood there, you took it. I've thought about that a lot. How did you do that?" The question hung in the air between them. It was a genuine plea from a man who had realized his own prison was closing in on him. Kai looked at his former boss, a man he had once feared and idolized, and he felt only a sense of shared humanity. "I stopped fighting battles that weren't mine to win," Kai said simply. "I learned to tell the difference between what is and what I think it means." He could see the words didn't fully land. Marcus was looking for a strategy, a technique, a secret advantage. He couldn't comprehend that the secret was subtraction, not addition. Before Marcus could respond, the bell on the door chimed and Julian Croft walked in. He saw Kai, then Marcus, and a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "Well, well," Julian said, his voice dripping with amusement. "A reunion of the fallen, Marcus. I hear Sterling Thorn is circling the drain. And Kai's still playing shopkeeper, I see. I told you. A weapon rusting." This was the final test. Not a test created by Silas, but one delivered by life itself. Here were the two architects of his old life. Marcus, the symbol of the corporate hierarchy he had once worshipped, and Julian, the symbol of the ruthless power he had once craved. They were here to pass judgment, to trigger the old wounds, to pull the old strings. Kai felt the initial impressions flash. The sting of Julian's condescension, the awkwardness of Marcus's presence. He saw the story his mind wanted to write, a story of humiliation, of needing to prove himself, to show them he was not a failure. He paused, he took a breath, he became the guard at the gate. The neutral fact: two men were standing in his bookstore. They were vibrating the air with sounds. Their opinions were thoughts in their own minds, a part of the universe utterly outside of his control. Their story about him was not his story. He refused to assent. He looked at Julian, not with anger or defiance, but with a calm, neutral gaze. "Hello, Julian. Can I help you find something? Or are you just here to browse?" The simple, unaffected question completely disarmed Julian. He had come for a reaction. He had come to gloat, to see the wound he had tried to inflict. But there was no wound. Kai was not playing his game. He was not even on the same field. He was operating from a place Julian couldn't touch. Julian's smile vanished. For the second time, he looked at Kai with that strange, unsettled expression of disbelief. He saw a man who owned the ground he stood on, and he realized it was a ground no amount of money could buy. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the store, the bell on the door marking his defeat. Marcus stared after him, then looked back at Kai, his face a canvas of confusion and dawning respect. "He came here just for that," Marcus murmured, "to get under your skin, and it didn't work." He looked around the bookstore, at the calm, ordered space, at the man standing peacefully in the center of it. "You're not rusting," Marcus said, a quiet revelation in his voice. "You're solid." Kai gave a small, genuine smile. "I'm just building something," he said. After Marcus left, Kai stood for a long moment in the quiet of his store. He had faced the ghosts of his past, and he had not flinched. He had not fought them. He had simply seen them for what they were: shadows, illusions, stories. They had no power over him because he refused to give it to them. The Citadel was complete. The foundation was the dichotomy of control, the understanding of what was his and what was not. The walls were amber fatty, the strength to embrace every obstacle as a gift. The watchtower was the mastery of Ascent, the vigilant guard that protected him from the tyranny of his own judgments. It was not a fortress designed to keep the world out. It was a fortress that allowed him to engage with the world completely, without fear, because he was secure in the one kingdom that truly mattered. Later that evening, he walked to the brownstone one last time. He knew, somehow, that Silas would be waiting. The door was open. Silas was standing by the window, looking out at the walled garden. "An apprentice no longer," Silas said, without turning around. "You taught me how to build," Kai said. "No," Silas corrected, finally turning to face him. "I did not teach you how to build. I taught you how to clear the land. The building was your own. It always is." He walked toward Kai and placed a hand on his shoulder. It was the first time he had ever made physical contact. "The journey does not end. A citadel is not a monument. It is a living thing. It must be maintained, reinforced, and guarded every day. Life will never stop testing its walls. Do not wish for it to stop. The tests are what keep the walls strong." Kai understood. This was not an end but a beginning. The ascent was not a climb to a final peak, but the beginning of a new way of walking. "What will you do now?" Silas asked. Kai thought of his bookstore, of Mr. Abernathy, of the quiet purpose he had found. He thought of the endless opportunities the world presented, not for gain but for practice, for virtue, for contribution. "I will live," Kai said, "and I will be ready for what comes." The words were simple, but they held the weight of his entire journey. They were the words of a free man. As you stand at the threshold of your own life, watching this story, you are the apprentice. The chaos of the world, the opinions of others, your own fears and anxieties, they are all laying siege to your mind. You have been living in a fortress made of sand, haven't you? A structure built of praise, of titles, of fleeting victories, ready to collapse at the first sign of a storm. But within you lies the bedrock. Within you lies the ability to build something that cannot be shaken. The question is not whether the storm will come. The storm is always coming. The question is, what will it find when it arrives? A pile of rubble or an inner citadel standing calm and resolute against the wind? The demolition of your old self is a noisy, terrifying process, but it is the only path to true strength. The first step is to pick up the first tool. What false belief, what story you tell yourself, will you demolish today? Share the first stone of your old prison that you will tear down in the comments below. Join the community of builders. For the apprentice's ascent is not a lonely path. It is a shared chronicle of mastering the fortress within. And your journey has just begun.